The air here is thick with something older than memory. Somewhere beneath these jungle canopies, beneath centuries of moss and silence, an entire civilization is waiting to be found. Not fragments, not ruins. A complete world, its ambitions carved into stone, its genius buried in water, its soul still breathing inside the oldest living temple on earth. Welcome. What you are about to witness is not a ruin. It is a resurrection. Here is a question that should stop you cold. How does a people living in the floodplains of mainland Southeast Asia, surrounded by dense rainforest and seasonal monsoon waters, build the largest pre-industrial city the world has ever known? How do they raise towers that mirror the mountains of the gods, engineer reservoirs that sustain nearly 1 million people, and carve half a kilometer of continuous stone narrative that tells the story of creation itself? And then, how does all of it vanish beneath the jungle, only to be rediscovered centuries later, still sacred, still standing, still capable of making the modern world fall silent? That is the story of Angkor. And that is exactly what we are going to follow from the very beginning to the very end. This is a complete journey. We begin long before the great temples in the ancient Indianized kingdom of Funan along the Mekong Delta, where the first seeds of Khmer civilization were planted by traders, priests, and kings who fused Indian cosmology with indigenous tradition. We follow the fragmentation of Chenla, the rival principalities, and the moment in 802 CE, when a warrior king named Jayavarman II climbed a sacred plateau called Phnom Kulen and declared himself a Devaraja, a god king, and changed the course of Southeast Asian history forever. From that declaration, we trace the rise of an empire. We walk the corridors of Angkor Wat, commissioned around 1113 CE by Suryavarman II, as a cosmological statement in sandstone dedicated to Vishnu. 400 acres of sacred geometry, surrounded by a moat 190 meters wide, decorated with carvings of such precision and beauty that scholars still struggle to fully explain how they were made. We enter Angkor Thom, the walled city of 9 square kilometers built by Jayavarman VII, where 54 towers of the Bayon Temple bear 216 colossal stone faces gazing outward in every direction, serene and unknowable. We step away from the royal courts and into the lives of ordinary Khmer people, the rice farmers, the silk weavers, the market traders, the Apsara dancers whose carved forms cover thousands of temple walls. We follow the hydraulic engineers who built a network of canals and reservoirs so sophisticated that modern satellite imaging is still mapping its full extent. And then we follow the unraveling, the droughts, the floods, the rising Thai kingdoms pressing from the west, the sack of 1431, the slow return of the jungle, and finally, the legacy, the artistic traditions, the cosmological ideas, the architectural vocabulary that spread across Southeast Asia and never truly disappeared. Angkor Wat remains on the Cambodian flag today. It is the only ancient monument depicted on a modern nation's flag. That single fact tells you everything about what this civilization meant, and what it still means. If this kind of complete journey through the ancient world is something you value, please subscribe. Each week, we bring you the full story of a lost civilization. Not fragments, not highlights, but the entire arc from origin to legacy. Let us begin our journey. The water moves before anything else. Along the lower reaches of the Mekong River, where the delta fans outward into 1,000 braided channels, the land and the river are barely separate things. Seasonal floods deposit rich silt across the plains. Fish fill the shallows in numbers that seem impossible. And somewhere along these margins, in the first centuries of the Common Era, a civilization begins to take shape. The kingdom the Chinese call Funan emerges here, in the Mekong Delta, around the 1st century CE. It is not a kingdom in the monumental sense, not yet. It is a network of chieftaincies bound together by trade, water, and the slow absorption of ideas arriving by sea. Ships from India bring more than goods. They carry Sanskrit, Brahmin priests, the iconography of Shiva and Vishnu, and a concept of kingship rooted in divine cosmology. The local rulers receive these ideas and make them their own. At the port of Och-Io, archaeologists have uncovered Roman coins, Indian seals, and Chinese mirrors, all within the same excavation layers. This single site speaks to Funan's position at the center of a maritime world, stretching from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. The kingdom grows wealthy on transit trade, taxing the movement of goods between India and China. Its rulers adopt Sanskrit names and commission Brahmin rituals. The fusion is not imposition. It is transformation. By the 6th century, a new power rises inland. Chenla, rooted in the Cambodian basin rather than the coastal delta, gradually absorbs Funan's territories. Its capital at Isanapura, modern Sambor Prey Kuk, becomes one of the most sophisticated urban centers in Southeast Asia. The brick towers that still stand there, their surfaces carved with intricate floral medallions and guardian figures, represent the earliest surviving Khmer temple architecture. Sanskrit inscriptions on stone stelae record royal genealogies, land grants, and dedications to Shiva. The language of power is now written in stone, but Chenla does not hold. By the 8th century, the kingdom fractures into rival principalities, what Chinese sources call Land Chenla and Water Chenla, competing for dominance across a fragmented landscape. The coherent state dissolves into a collection of competing courts, each claiming legitimacy, none commanding the whole. Into this fractured world, a man returns from Java. Jayavarman II has spent years at the Sailendra court, absorbing its political culture, its architectural ambitions, its understanding of how a king might become something more than human. He returns to the Cambodian basin around 790 CE and begins the slow, methodical work of consolidation, moving his court multiple times, subduing rivals, building alliances, and drawing the scattered principalities back toward a single center. In 802 CE, he ascends the Phnom Kulin Plateau, a sandstone massif rising above the Cambodian plain, dense with forest and threaded with streams. There, in a ceremony conducted by a Brahmin priest named Hiranyadama, Jayavarman II performs the Devaraja ritual, consecrating himself as the god king, the earthly embodiment of Shiva's divine power, sovereign of a realm no longer subject to any foreign court. The ceremony severs the last symbolic ties to Javanese authority. A new political order is declared. The plateau itself seems chosen with intention. Its rivers flow outward in 4 directions. Its elevation commands the plain below. Standing there, the world below appears as something to be ordered, measured, and transformed. Jayavarman II does not yet know what will be built on that plain, but the declaration made on Phnom Kulin sets the terms for everything that follows. A civilization has named itself. The Khmer Empire has begun. The plain below Phnom Kulin is not empty. It never was. Seasonal floodwaters from the Tonle Sap spread across the lowlands each year, retreating to leave behind a layer of dark, mineral-rich silt. The land breathes with water, and it is this rhythm, the annual pulse of flood and withdrawal, that the Khmer engineers will learn to read, redirect, and ultimately command. Jayavarman II rules. For decades after 802 CE, consolidating territory, suppressing rival lords, moving his court between several sites across the Cambodian basin, he does not yet build in stone on the scale that will define his successors. His reign is one of political architecture, the assembling of a kingdom from fragmented principalities. When he dies around 835 CE, the foundation is set, but the great construction has not yet begun. His son, Jayavarman III, continues the consolidation. The empire holds. But it is the reign of Indravarman I, beginning around 877 CE, that transforms ambition into stone and water on a scale the region has never witnessed. Indravarman I rules from Hariharalaya, the settlement known today as Roluos, situated roughly 15 kilometers southeast of what will become the heart of Angkor. His first act, according to inscriptions, is to promise his people irrigation before temples. It is a statement of priorities that reveals how deeply water and power are intertwined in Khmer governance. The Indratataka Barre is the result. Stretching approximately 3.8 kilometers in length and 800 meters in width, it is an artificial reservoir of extraordinary scale. A flat, still mirror of water held behind earthen embankments, fed by channels drawing from the Roluos River. The engineering is deliberate and precise. Water enters from the north, distributes through a network of smaller canals, and flows outward to irrigate the surrounding rice fields. For the first time, the Khmer agricultural cycle is no longer entirely dependent on the unpredictable rhythms of seasonal flooding. The harvest becomes something that can be managed, extended, multiplied. But the barre is never only practical. In Khmer cosmology, water carries sacred meaning. The ocean surrounds Mount Meru at the center of the universe. A reservoir surrounding a temple is not merely irrigation. It is a cosmological statement, a recreation of the primordial sea encircling the axis of creation. This understanding shapes everything Indravarman I builds next. In 879 CE, he consecrates the Prayako temple complex, the sacred bull, dedicating it to his royal ancestors and to the god Shiva. 6 brick towers rise from a laterite platform, their surfaces once covered in fine lime plaster, carved with intricate floral patterns, guardian figures, and Sanskrit inscriptions. The towers are not large by later Khmer standards, but their grammar is precise and intentional. They establish the vocabulary that every subsequent Khmer temple will speak. The elevated platform, the tower sanctuary, the axial approach, the enclosing wall. 2 years later, Indravarman I begins the Bakong, the first true temple mountain built in stone at Angkor's precursor site. 5 tiers of sandstone rise from a laterite base, the whole structure oriented to the cardinal directions, its summit tower reaching toward the sky as a physical embodiment of Mount Meru. Surrounding it, the waters of the Indratataka reflect the tower's silhouette at dawn. The message is unmistakable. The God-King does not merely rule the land, he replicates the cosmos upon it. Every reservoir is a sacred ocean. Every tower is the mountain at the world's center. Water and stone are not separate systems. They are a single theological argument made visible across the landscape. By 900 CE, the architectural and hydraulic grammar of the Khmer Empire is fully formed. What follows will be larger, more refined, more ambitious. But the logic is already here, written in brick and water on the Roluo's plain, waiting for the kings who will carry it northward onto the vast flat canvas of the Angkor Basin. The kings who follow carry that logic northward, exactly as the landscape invites them to do. Yasovarman I ascends to power around 889 CE, inheriting an empire whose foundations are solid, but whose ambitions have not yet found their fullest expression. He is a ruler of extraordinary energy, a builder, a theologian, a military commander, and he understands immediately that the Roluo's plain, for all its achievements, is too small for what the Khmer Empire is becoming. His gaze moves north and west, toward the vast flat basin stretching between the Kulen Plateau and the northern shore of the Tonle Sap. That basin is the canvas. Yasovarman intends to fill it. The first act of the new capital is water. Around 900 CE, Yasovarman's engineers begin constructing the East Barai, a reservoir of staggering scale, measuring 7.5 kilometers in length and 1.8 kilometers in width. Seen from the air, it is less a reservoir than a shallow inland sea, its earthen embankments rising several meters above the surrounding plain, its surface capable of holding tens of millions of cubic meters of water. The engineering logic is the same as at Roluo's, but the ambition has multiplied. This single reservoir can sustain rice cultivation across a region that no previous hydraulic system could reach. The population that follows the water northward begins to reshape the Angkor Plain permanently. At the center of the East Barai, Yasovarman places a small island temple, the East Mabon, though that name belongs to a later reign. The symbolic vocabulary is already established. Water as cosmic ocean, temple as the mountain rising from its center. The theology and the engineering speak the same language. Yasovarman also commissions a network of ashrams, religious retreats, distributed across the empire, each dedicated simultaneously to Shaivism, Vaishnavism, and Buddhism, a deliberate theological inclusivity that reflects the complexity of Khmer religious identity. Inscriptions from these ashrams survive, recording in Sanskrit the king's titles, his genealogy, and his piety. They are administrative documents and devotional texts at once. But Yasovarman's reign ends around 910 CE, and what follows is a century of instability that tests the empire's coherence. Rival claimants fracture the royal succession, power shifts, courts relocate, and the architectural momentum of the Angkor Plain briefly pauses. The most dramatic interruption comes under Jayavarman IV, who rules from 928 to 941 CE, and moves the imperial capital entirely, not northward or southward, but northeast, to a remote site called Khmer, deep in the forested uplands. There, far from the hydraulic infrastructure of Angkor, he constructs a new sacred center. Its defining monument is Prasat Tom, a sandstone pyramid rising approximately 30 meters above the forest floor in 7 steep tiers. It is an audacious structure, angular, compressed, almost aggressive in its verticality compared to the more measured proportions of earlier temple mountains. At its summit, a massive stone linga once stood, asserting divine kingship over a capital that history would ultimately judge as temporary. Khmer endures for little more than a decade as an imperial center. After Jayavarman IV's death, the court returns to Angkor, and the Khmer complex gradually recedes into the forest, its sandstone towers slowly consumed by roots and canopy. The return to Angkor under Rajendravarman II, who reigns from 944 to 968 CE, restores momentum. He builds the Pre-Rup Temple around 961 CE, a tiered pyramid of laterite and sandstone whose upper towers glow deep amber at sunset, the iron-rich stone absorbing and releasing the day's light in slow gradations. He also completes the East Mebon on its artificial island within the East Bare, its 5 towers arranged in a quincunx pattern that mirrors the cosmic mountain's 5 peaks. The water surrounding it at the height of the rainy season transforms the temple into exactly what its builders intended, a mountain rising from a sacred sea. By the close of the 10th century, the Angkor Plain bears the marks of 3 generations of ambition, rivalry, and restoration. The East Bare anchors the landscape. The Temple Mountains rise at intervals across the basin. The hydraulic and theological systems are deepening together, each reinforcing the other. What the next century will bring is not a new logic, but the same logic pursued with a refinement and a scale that will leave the world without comparison. The 11th century opens not with a single king, but with a contest. The Angkor Plain, already layered with reservoirs and temple mountains, becomes the stage for a prolonged struggle over succession. It is from this turbulence that Suryavarman I emerges, a ruler whose origins lie in the Malay Peninsula, whose claim to the throne is disputed, and whose determination to hold power reshapes the empire's western boundaries entirely. By 1006 CE, Suryavarman I consolidates his grip on Angkor after years of military and political maneuvering. What follows is a reign of expansion. His armies push westward across the Dongrek Mountains and into the Chao Phraya Basin, extending Khmer authority into territories that will one day become central Thailand. Garrison temples mark the new frontier. Inscriptions in Sanskrit and Khmer appear on stone stelae at the edges of the known world, each one a declaration that the god-king's reach has no natural limit. At Angkor itself, Suryavarman I commissions the royal palace enclosure, a walled compound of laterite and sandstone at the heart of the capital, anchoring the administrative and ceremonial life of the empire. The Phai-Mianika's temple rises within its walls, a gilded tower that ancient Chinese sources describe as the king's nightly residence, a place where the divine and the human were understood to meet. The palace complex does not survive in its original form. Its wooden halls and pavilions have long since dissolved into the soil, but the stone foundations remain, and they speak to a capital that was already, by the mid-11th century, one of the largest and most organized urban centers on Earth. Suryavarman I dies around 1050 CE. The decades that follow are again marked by succession disputes, brief reigns, and the slow accumulation of pressure at the empire's edges. Then, in 1113 CE, a new king seizes power. His name is Suryavarman II, and what he builds will outlast every dynasty, every drought, every jungle that has ever tried to swallow stone. The project begins almost immediately, on a site northwest of the East Bare, on an axis oriented not to the east, as nearly all previous Khmer temples had been, but deliberately, precisely to the west. The foundations of Angkor Wat are laid. The western orientation is a theological statement. West is the direction of Vishnu, the preserver, the cosmic sovereign to whom this temple is dedicated. It is also, in Khmer cosmology, the direction of the setting sun, of completion, of eternity. The scale is without precedent. The outer enclosure wall runs nearly 1.5 kilometers on each side. A moat 190 meters wide surrounds the entire complex, its surface so vast that the temple's 5 towers are reflected in the water at dawn like a second sky. The causeway approaching the western entrance stretches 350 meters across the moat, lined with balustrades carved in the form of nagas, the great serpents of Hindu cosmology, their multi-headed forms fanning outward at each end. Inside, the architecture ascends in 3 concentric galleries toward the central tower, which rises 65 meters above the ground. 4 smaller towers surrounded in the quincunx arrangement that the Khmer had refined across 2 centuries of temple building, each one representing a peak of Mount Meru, the cosmic axis at the center of the Hindu universe. The sandstone used in construction is quarried at Phnom Kulen, floated down canals to the site. An engineering operation involving thousands of workers, oxen, and rivercraft sustained across nearly 4 decades. The bas-relief galleries that run along the inner enclosure walls stretch for nearly half a kilometer in continuous narrative. The southern gallery depicts Suryavarman II himself in royal procession, surrounded by his court and his armies, a rare portrait of a living king carved into sacred stone. The eastern gallery presents the churning of the ocean of milk, gods and demons pulling a cosmic serpent around Mount Mandara, churning the primordial sea to release the nectar of immortality. The carving is executed with a precision and fluency that no subsequent civilization in Southeast Asia will surpass. Angkor Wat is completed around 1150 CE, near the end of Suryavarman II's reign. By then, his armies have campaigned into Champa to the east and sent embassies to the Song dynasty court in China. The empire is at its greatest territorial extent, and at its center stands a monument that is not merely a temple, but a cosmological diagram in sandstone, heaven made visible, permanent, and earthbound. The empire that Suryavarman II left behind does not hold. Within a generation of Angkor Wat's completion, the Khmer state fractures under the pressure of succession disputes and external aggression. The Cham kingdom of coastal Vietnam, long a rival and occasional vassal, seizes the moment. In 1177 CE, a Cham fleet navigates the Mekong River and crosses the Tonle Sap, striking Angkor from the water, an approach no enemy has attempted before. The capital is sacked. The reigning Khmer king is killed. For the first time in nearly 4 centuries, Angkor falls to a foreign power. The silence that follows does not last long. A prince who has spent years in political obscurity, possibly at the Cham court itself, emerges to lead the Khmer resistance. His name is Jayavarman VII. By 1181 CE, he has driven the Cham forces from the capital and declared himself king. He is already in his 50s, old by the standards of his era, and he rules with the urgency of a man who understands that time is finite and the work is vast. What follows is the most concentrated period of construction in Khmer history. Jayavarman VII does not simply rebuild what was lost. He reimagines the empire entirely, and he does so under a new religious identity. Where his predecessors built for Shiva and Vishnu, Jayavarman VII builds for the Buddha, specifically for the Mahayana Buddhist ideal of the Bodhisattva, the enlightened being who delays final liberation to relieve the suffering of others. That theological shift reshapes everything: the iconography, the architecture, the stated purpose of kingship itself. His first great project is Angkor Thom, a new royal city constructed around and above the older Angkor complex. Its outer wall runs for 8 kilometers, enclosing 9 square kilometers of urban space. 5 monumental gates pierce the wall, each approached by a causeway flanked by rows of stone figures, gods on one side, demons on the other, holding the body of a great Naga serpent, a visual echo of the cosmic churning carved into Angkor Wat's galleries. The south gate is the most intact today. Its towers rise above the jungle canopy, each face carved with 4 serene expressions, gazing toward the cardinal directions. At the center of Angkor, Thom stands the Bayon. Unlike the mountain temples of earlier kings, the Bayon does not rise as a single pyramid. It accumulates, a dense cluster of 54 towers pressing upward from a cruciform base, each tower bearing 4 carved faces on its upper register. 216 faces in total, all sharing the same slight smile, the same half-closed eyes, the same expression that scholars have debated for over a century. Some read the face as the Buddha, others see the king himself, his compassion made monumental and multiplied across the skyline of his capital. Beyond Angkor Thom, the construction continues outward. Ta Prohm is built as a monastery and university, its foundation stele recording that it housed over 12,000 people and was supported by villages across the empire. Preah Khan to the north serves similar functions. Both temples are built in laterite and sandstone, their galleries extending through multiple enclosures, their walls dense with Devata figures and narrative reliefs. Today, Ta Prohm is famous for what time has added. The roots of strangler figs and silk cotton trees descend through its stone vaults, splitting lintels and embracing towers in a slow, patient grip that no human hand directed. Jayavarman VII also builds outward from the capital in ways no previous king attempted. Across the empire, he establishes 102 hospitals and 121 rest houses positioned along the royal roads. Inscriptions record the medicines stocked in each hospital, the staff assigned, the rituals performed. Whether this network functioned as described or represents royal aspiration carved in stone remains a question archaeology continues to examine. But the intention is legible. A king who defines his power not only through temples and reservoirs, but through the care of bodies across a vast territory. He reigns until approximately 1218 CE. By then, the Khmer Empire has reached its greatest geographic extent, and its capital has been transformed into a Buddhist city unlike anything else in the medieval world. The stone faces of the Bayon look outward in every direction, calm, watchful, and impossible to read with certainty. They are the last great statement of Angkor's imperial confidence, carved in the full knowledge that heaven, once built, must still be maintained. The stone faces watch over a city that is not made of stone. Behind the temple walls, beyond the moats and the sandstone galleries, the real Angkor spreads outward in wood and thatch and water. A vast, breathing urban landscape that archaeology is only beginning to fully map. The Greater Angkor Project's LiDAR surveys have revealed a low-density urban sprawl extending across more than 1,000 square kilometers, threaded with embankments, ponds, and the foundations of structures long since returned to soil. At its peak, the Angkor region may have sustained between 700,000 and 900,000 people. This is not a temple complex with a city attached. It is one of the largest urban concentrations the pre-industrial world has ever produced. The houses of ordinary Khmer people do not survive. They were built from timber and palm leaf, raised on stilts above the seasonal floodwaters that transformed the lowlands each monsoon. What survives instead is a written record. In 1296 CE, A Chinese diplomat named Zhou Daguan arrives in Angkor as part of a diplomatic mission from the Yuan court. He stays for nearly a year and records what he observes with the careful attention of a trained observer in a foreign land. His account, known as the Customs of Cambodia, remains the most detailed eyewitness description of Angkor at the height of its functioning civilization. Zhou Daguan describes a city of movement and commerce. Markets operate daily, managed largely by women, a detail he notes with evident surprise, accustomed to different commercial arrangements at home. Khmer women conduct trade openly, exchanging rice, fish, cloth, and forest products with Chinese merchants who bring silk, porcelain, and metal goods from the north. The Tonle Sap Lake, just south of the capital, provides extraordinary quantities of fish. Its seasonal flood cycle, expanding to 3 times its dry season size each monsoon, creates one of the most productive freshwater fisheries in the world. Fish, fermented into paste and sauce, forms the protein foundation of the Khmer diet across every social level. Zhou Daguan also describes the royal processions that move through Angkor Thom. The king carried on a golden palanquin, preceded by soldiers and musicians, surrounded by hundreds of women bearing candles even in daylight. These processions are not merely ceremonial. They are the visible performance of cosmic order, the God-King moving through his earthly domain as a living axis between heaven and the people below. The artisans who shape the temples occupy a distinct social position. The Apsara figures carved into Angkor Wat's sandstone walls, over 3,000 individual figures, each subtly differentiated in jewelry, headdress, and expression, represent years of accumulated craft knowledge passed through generations of workshops. The carvers work within established iconographic conventions, but within those conventions there is room for variation, for personality, for the quiet assertion of individual skill. Silk weaving, documented in bas-reliefs and confirmed by Zhou Daguan, follows similar patterns of inherited technique and careful refinement. The Brahmin priestly class maintains the Sanskrit ritual traditions that underpin royal legitimacy, even as Mahayana Buddhism reshapes the empire's public religious identity under Jayavarman VII's successors. Temples require constant ritual maintenance, offerings, incantations, the tending of sacred fires. Inscriptions record the endowment of temple estates, land, rice, servants, and ritual specialists assigned in perpetuity to maintain the ceremonies that keep the cosmic order intact. What Zhou Daguan captures, and what archaeology continues to confirm, is a civilization of extraordinary density and complexity, operating beneath the stone monuments that have drawn the world's attention for centuries. The temples are the visible peak of something much larger, a society organized around water, rice, ritual, and the careful management of a landscape that gives generously but demands constant attention in return. The society that Zhou Daguan observed in 1296 is already living inside a long, slow fracture. The signs are not yet visible in the markets or the temple courtyards, but they are accumulating in the landscape, in the ledgers of the state, and in the distant territories where Khmer authority is beginning to thin. Jayavarman VII dies around 1218 CE, leaving behind an empire transformed but also exhausted. The scale of his construction campaigns, Angkor Thom, the Bayon, Te Prom, Preah Khan, the network of hospitals and rest houses, had demanded resources of extraordinary magnitude. Stone had to be quarried from Phnom Kulen and floated down canals. Tens of thousands of laborers, artisans, and ritual specialists had to be fed, organized, and sustained across decades. Inscriptions from his reign record the dedication of nearly 300,000 workers and officials to the maintenance of temple estates alone. The hydraulic system that made all of this possible, the barays, the canals, the carefully graded earthworks, required continuous maintenance to function. When royal attention and royal resources contracted after his death, the infrastructure began to accumulate small failures. The religious landscape shifts as well. Jayavarman VII's successors gradually restore Hindu practice, and some of his Buddhist monuments are modified or defaced. The ideological coherence that had unified the empire under a single cosmic vision begins to loosen. Without a builder king of comparable ambition, the machinery of centralized power turns more slowly. Beyond the capital's horizon, the political map of mainland Southeast Asia is being redrawn. In the upland valleys to the northwest, Thai-speaking peoples, long present in the region as subordinate communities within the Khmer sphere, begin consolidating into independent polities. Around 1238 CE, the kingdom of Sukhothai emerges in the upper Chao Phraya basin, drawing away territories that Khmer kings had governed for generations. It is not a sudden rupture, but a gradual withdrawal, like a tide receding from a shoreline it had held for centuries. The 14th century brings pressures that no political strategy could fully absorb. Modern climate science, drawing on tree ring records from across Southeast Asia and sediment cores extracted from Angkor's reservoirs, has revealed a pattern of severe instability. The University of Sydney's Greater Angkor project identified decades of intense drought in the mid-14th century, followed by episodes of catastrophic monsoon flooding. For a civilization whose entire agricultural economy depended on the precise management of water, filling the barays during the rains, releasing it through the dry season, channeling it across hundreds of kilometers of paddy fields. This volatility was not merely inconvenient, it was structurally devastating. Sediment analysis shows that the great canals began silting at accelerated rates. Flood events carved new channels through earthworks that had taken generations to build. The West Baray, the largest reservoir in the system, shows evidence of reduced capacity during this period. When the water system faltered, the rice harvest faltered with it. When the harvest faltered, the population that had grown to fill the Angkor basin over 4 centuries faced a crisis the stone temples could not resolve. In 1351 CE, Ayutthaya is founded in the lower Chao Phraya Valley. A new Thai kingdom that absorbs Khmer courtly traditions, Khmer artistic forms, and Khmer administrative models, even as it positions itself as Angkor's most formidable rival. The crumbling laterite walls of Angkor's outer precincts, the overgrown canal banks where the jungle has begun reclaiming the earthworks, tell the story of a system under pressure from every direction at once: political, climatic, economic, and spiritual. The fracture is not yet complete, but the stone is cracking. The fracture becomes a collapse in stages, each one more decisive than the last. Ayutthaya, founded in 1351 CE at the confluence of the Chao Phraya and its tributaries, moves quickly. Within the same year of its founding, Ayutthayan forces press eastward against Khmer-held territories. The first invasion reaches Angkor, testing its defenses, probing the edges of a system already weakened by decades of hydraulic failure and administrative strain. The Khmer court repels this early assault, but the cost is significant: soldiers, resources, and the psychological weight of knowing that a new power has risen that speaks the language of Khmer statecraft while wielding it against Angkor itself. The second major Ayutthayan campaign arrives in 1393 CE. This time, the pressure is sustained and deeper. Khmer resistance holds the capital, but the western territories, the lands that Surya Varman I had absorbed into the empire 4 centuries earlier, are progressively lost. The buffer zones dissolve. Trade routes that once fed Angkor's markets shift toward coastal ports and the rising Thai commercial networks. The Great Bears, already compromised by sedimentation and broken infrastructure, no longer sustain the agricultural surplus that once supported a population of nearly 1 million. The city contracts inward around its temples. By the early 15th century, Angkor is a diminished but still functioning capital. Buddhist monks tend the shrines. Communities persist along the canal banks. Angkor Wat, already more than 2 centuries old, continues to receive offerings. But the administrative machinery that once coordinated labor across thousands of square kilometers has lost its coherence. The last known Sanskrit inscription at Angkor dates to 1327 CE, a silence that speaks to the slow erosion of the Brahmin scholarly class and the ritual infrastructure that had sustained royal legitimacy for 500 years. In 1431 CEE, Ayutthaya strikes with decisive force. The campaign is not a raid, but an occupation. Ayutthayan armies surround the walled city of Angkor Thom, its 8 kilometers of laterite ramparts still standing, its moats still holding water. The siege is prolonged. When the walls are breached, the Khmer court does not fight to the last stone. The king, Ponhayat, withdraws. What follows the withdrawal is systematic. Ayutthayan forces remain in Angkor for several months, and when they depart, they carry with them the living treasures of Khmer civilization: artisans, court dancers, scholars, and Brahmin priests, absorbed into Ayutthaya's own cultural project. The stone temples cannot be carried away. Everything else can. Ponhayat leads the court southward along the Tonle Sap and the Mekong, eventually establishing a new capital near the confluence of the Mekong and Tonle Sap rivers, the site of modern Phnom Penh. The location is deliberate. Where Angkor had been an inland hydraulic capital oriented around rice and reservoir, Phnom Penh faces outward toward maritime trade, toward the South China Sea, toward a world in which the great overland empire is no longer viable. What remains at Angkor is not nothing. Buddhist monks continue to inhabit the temple complexes. Angkor Wat is never fully abandoned. Communities persist in the surrounding landscape, farming the same fields their ancestors had irrigated for centuries. But the jungle moves faster than memory. Strangler figs send roots down through sandstone joints. Laterite walls buckle under the weight of root systems older than any living witness. The stone corridors that once echoed with royal processions fill with silence and green shadow. The civilization that declared itself heaven on earth does not end with a single catastrophic moment. It ends the way great systems often end, through accumulation, through the slow withdrawal of the conditions that made it possible, through the patient indifference of the forest reclaiming what stone had temporarily displaced. The towers of Angkor Thom still rise above the canopy. The faces on the Bayonne still gaze outward in every direction, but the empire that built them has moved on, carrying its traditions southward into a smaller, quieter world. The jungle does not surrender its secrets quickly. For more than a century after the Khmer court moved southward, the temples of Angkor remain inhabited, tended by Buddhist monks, visited by pilgrims, maintained in fragments by communities who never entirely abandoned the stone city their ancestors built. The forest advances, but it does not conquer completely. Angkor Wat itself continues as a living place of worship through the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. Its western causeway still worn smooth by the feet of the faithful. Portuguese missionaries moving through mainland Southeast Asia in the 16th century encounter the temples and record their astonishment. A friar named Antonio da Madalena visits in 1586 and describes towers of extraordinary workmanship rising from the forest, structures he struggles to reconcile with any civilization he has previously encountered. His account reaches Europe but generates little sustained attention. The world is not yet ready to look. It is Henri Mouhot, a French naturalist traveling through Cambodia in 1860, who changes everything. His published journals and sketches, detailed, precise, filled with wonder, introduce Angkor Wat to a European audience hungry for lost civilizations. Mouhot does not discover Angkor. The Khmer people never lost it. But his writings ignite a century of Western scholarly attention. The École Française d'Extrême Orient, established in 1900, begins systematic documentation and restoration work that continues for decades, clearing vegetation, cataloging inscriptions, and reassembling collapsed galleries, stone by stone. What emerges from that work is a civilization of staggering complexity. The inscriptions carved into temple doorways reveal administrative systems, land grants, religious endowments, and royal genealogies stretching across 4 centuries. The bas-reliefs of Angkor Wat and the Bayonne preserve images of markets, armies, fishing boats, and royal processions that no written chronicle fully captures. Angkor's artistic vocabulary, the Lotus Tower, the Apsara figure, the Naga balustrade, spreads recognition across Southeast Asia, visible in the temple architecture of Thailand, the court traditions of Laos, the classical dance forms still performed in Cambodia today. In 1992, UNESCO designates Angkor a World Heritage Site, triggering an international restoration effort that brings together teams from France, Japan, India, Germany, and Cambodia itself. Scaffolding rises against ancient sandstone. Collapsed lintels are carefully repositioned. The work is slow, methodical, and never finished, because Angkor, it turns out, is far larger than anyone imagined. The revelation comes from the sky. Beginning in 2012, aerial LIDAR surveys conducted by the Greater Angkor Project strip away the forest canopy digitally, exposing the ground beneath. What the data reveals reshapes understanding entirely. Angkor was not a dense urban core surrounded by farmland. It was a low-density urban sprawl extending across more than 1,000 square kilometers. A vast, interconnected landscape of temples, reservoirs, embankments, rice fields, and residential neighborhoods housing nearly 1 million people at its height. It is the largest pre-industrial urban complex ever identified on Earth. The stone temples are only the most visible fraction of what was built. Beneath the forest floor lie the ghost outlines of wooden structures, market areas, and hydraulic channels that sustained a civilization for 6 centuries. Every new survey adds detail to a picture that grows more intricate, more human, and more extraordinary with each passing year. Angkor Wat still stands at the center of it all. Its 5 lotus towers still rise above the western causeway at dawn, their reflections still trembling in the moat, that has held water for 900 years. Cambodian classical dancers still perform before its galleries, their hand gestures tracing the same movements carved into the stone walls behind them. The temple appears on Cambodia's national flag, the only ancient monument so honored by a modern nation. A declaration that this civilization, however transformed, has never truly ended. The jungle kept the stone, the people kept everything else, and what remains in temple and tradition and living memory is the inheritance of a civilization that once looked at the world and decided to build heaven inside it. Thank you for joining this journey through one of history's most extraordinary civilizations. If these stories moved you, subscribe to the channel. There are many more worlds waiting to be uncovered.